Ready, Lisa?
I am ready.
All right. Renewable Learning and the Museum of the Rockies. My name is Jamie Oggs. I'll be your host for today's program, and I'd like to introduce you to Lisa Verwys, Museum of the Rockies Registrar and Collections Manager for Cultural History. In just a minute, Lisa will engage us about women's suffrage in the West. Like most of you, we're working from our homes today, while Lisa's actually at the museum. Though the museum is temporarily closed to the public, we're excited to bring the research and collections to you at your home. Before we get started, I want to talk to you about two features that Zoom has. One is the chat box, which you've already practiced using, and if you haven't already, go ahead and type in where you're tuning in from and what grade you're in. The second one is the Q&A box. Lisa may ask you questions. Feel free to answer those in there. And if you have questions for us, type those in there as well. I'll do my absolute best to get to as many of them as we possibly can. Getting to all of them is really challenging. So if you have a question and we don't answer it, I challenge you at the end of the program to find that answer on your own. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Thanks again for being here today. We're excited to interact with you and bring you museum content from our houses. Enjoy the program. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about women's suffrage in the West and really in the United States as a whole, because this year is the 100th anniversary of women having the right to vote in the US. Now, before we jump into the whole topic of women's suffrage, I want to tell you a little bit about Museum of the Rockies and a little bit about myself. If you haven't been to Montana, or if you're not from Montana, Museum of the Rockies is located in Bozeman. I circled it here on the map in front of you. You can see we're in the southwest corner of the state. We're located in the Rocky Mountains. It is snowing here today, still in May, and we're located just north of Yellowstone National Park. Here's what the museum looks like from the outside if you ever have a chance to come and visit us. And as you can see, a T-Rex will greet you when you get here, which probably tells you that we do have some great paleontology collections. Now, we also have really great history collections or cultural history collections, and that's what I work with here at the museum. So here's a picture of me at work in our storage area. When I say cultural history collections, what I mean is that I work on anything that humans have made or used or interacted with. So my job is to preserve artifacts for as long as possible. And those artifacts can be anything from an arrowhead to clothing, to photographs, to vehicles, anything that people have made or used or interacted with. And we use those objects to help illustrate the history of the lived human experience. So I try to keep those things in as good of condition as possible so that we can use them for things like public programs like this one, so that we can use them for research, and so that we can use them in museum exhibits. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use artifacts from the Museum of the Rockies collection and from the collections of other museums and explore women's suffrage in the West and in the US. So we're going to go through, this is how the talk is going to go through today. We're going to start on this national level. We're going to take a look at what's happening in the US. We're going to narrow it down and talk about the Western states a little bit. We're going to narrow it even further and talk about suffrage in Montana. And then we're going to go back out, zoom back out to a wider view and take a look at the nation again at the end. Before we get started, I do have a couple vocabulary words because I want to make sure that we are all on the same page about what exactly I'm talking about when I go through this presentation. So these probably look somewhat familiar to you if you've learned about women's suffrage before. So the first word I have for you is the word franchise. And a franchise is just a right or a privilege that's given to a certain group of people. And so in our instance today, the franchise is the right to vote. So we'll also call that suffrage or women's suffrage today. So if you have that certain right or privilege, that means that you are enfranchised. And if you don't have that certain right or privilege, then that means that you are disenfranchised. We're also going to use the term suffragist today, and that means a person of any gender who supports women's suffrage. And we're going to use that term instead of suffragette, which is a pretty common term, because suffragette was actually meant to be an insult. If you look at the cartoon on the right-hand side of the screen here, you'll see it's called The Origin and Development of a Suffragette. And essentially we see that the cartoonist uses this to make fun of suffragettes. They imply that women become suffragettes because they're old and they're lonely, and they imply that suffragettes are kind of angry and unattractive people. And this is how they try to deter women from wanting the right to vote or for working for the right to vote. And we'll come back to this argument later as well. But I want to start with the Seneca Falls Convention, which is a women's rights convention from 1848, and it actually took place in New York. It was organized by two women named Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this is a really important place to start because it is the first women's rights convention. So it's the first convention that is organized by women for the specific purpose of talking about women's rights. And so what came out of the Seneca Falls Convention is something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And so you see another museum artifact here. This is actually a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments was basically a list of ways that women wanted to see their legal or social status change so that they had more equality. And one of the things that they came up with, and you see it blown up here on the screen, is that women needed to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. So one of those basic backbones of the women's equal rights movement is that women wanted the right to vote. And this was really controversial at the time, but it started to become really important over the coming years. So as the women's rights movement moves forward, it actually does get interrupted by the Civil War. Everybody's lives were interrupted by the Civil War. So it's not until after the Civil War ends that we start seeing suffrage really start to move forward. And at that point, there was actually a really big split in the suffrage movement. So this is 1869, it's just after the Civil War, and we see on the national level that suffragists have decided to split into two different groups. One of those groups thinks that they're going to get women's suffrage through a federal constitutional amendment, and the other group thinks that it's a better approach to try to get women's suffrage one state at a time. So they do a state-by-state approach. I'm going to talk about the positives and negatives for each of these approaches, but while we're talking about it, I'd love it if you would use the chat box to tell me if you were a suffragist at the time, what do you think you would support, a constitutional amendment or the state-by-state approach? So when we look at a constitutional amendment, some of the benefits are that it gives universal suffrage for all women at one time in the entire country. So it's really fast acting and it works for everyone equally. But because of the constitutional amendment process, of course, you still need each of the states to ratify the amendment. You need 3/4 of the states to approve the amendment. So you still do have to do a state-by-state approach. But on the plus side, it makes it really easy for the suffragists to focus all of their efforts on the federal government. They have a really clear target of who they're going to lobby for the right to vote. On the other hand, the state-by-state approach is quite a bit slower, and you don't know how long it's going to take to get all of those states to approve suffrage. It also grants unequal rights to women throughout the country. So in some states they can vote, and in some states they can't. But it lets the suffragists focus their efforts on states that might be more likely to approve women's suffrage. And the thinking was, if enough states pass suffrage, then a constitutional amendment would follow. So Jamie, I don't know if we had any answers that you can share with me.
1 vote for the constitutional amendment approach, 2 votes for the constitutional amendment approach.
Great. So there's actually not really a right answer. Both of these groups work independently for the next 20 years, and neither of them really sees a whole lot of movement or a whole lot of traction. So after 20 years, they decide that they're going to rejoin each other, and they've decided that they're going to focus on a state-by-state approach. And they've decided that because at this point, any progress is going to be good progress for them, even if it's really slow. And they do make some very slow progress. So over the next 25 years, by 1915, we see 11 states grant women full suffrage, full voting rights. And interestingly, all of those states are west of the Mississippi. So you see those states here on the cartoon in white. And while I'm discussing the cartoon, go ahead and make your best guess as to which state you think gave suffrage to women first, which was the first in the country to give women the right to vote. And I want to talk about this cartoon really quickly, just because it's another great example of a museum artifact that shows us how cartoonists and political groups are trying to sway women's opinions on if suffrage is good or bad. So in the last cartoon that we saw that a suffragist was depicted as kind of ugly and unattractive and unpleasant. And in this cartoon, a suffragist is actually depicted as Lady Liberty, and she has these flowing gold clothes that say votes for women, and she's carrying this torch. And in the picture, you see she's walking from those 11 states that have granted suffrage, and she's heading towards the East Coast, where there's all these people reaching out to her, implying that they really want the right to vote too. They want her to bring her light over to them. So just a really great comparison of how we can use these different cartoons to interpret the feelings about suffrage at the time. Before we get to which state was first, we're going to talk a little bit about why the West seemed so ready to give women full rights to vote. And there were actually a lot of different reasons. There's no one definite reason why the West and Western states seemed so progressive in allowing women to vote. One of the many reasons were different types of political reasons. So the Western states were all really young at this time. They were the newest states in general in the country, and so they actually had quite a few less people there. Now, we all probably know that in our government, in some ways, the bigger the population in your state, the more representation you have in the federal government. And so lawmakers in the West thought that if they gave women the right to vote, that women would want to move west, and then their state would have more representation at the federal level. So that was one of the political reasons that women were able to gain the right to vote in the West. Another political reason was so that politicians could get more power at maybe a state or a local level. So politicians realized that if they pushed for women to have the right to vote, that women might then vote for them or for their party. And so that would give them more power locally as well. So those are some of the political reasons we're seeing to give women the right to vote. Another reason is this really unique homesteading and pioneering culture that we have in the West. And so you actually see two female homesteaders here. This is a picture from another museum here in Montana. And homesteading and the Homestead Act brought a lot of people to Montana and to the Western states to claim land and prove up their homesteads. That happened primarily after the Civil War and after the turn of the century. And up to 12% of those homesteaders were actually single women. And so we see suffrage really supported in homestead communities, because if you are a single woman who's moved out west, you have your own land, you have your own home, of course you would want to be able to vote in elections and on issues that affected your life. And so we see the homestead communities really support women's suffrage. We also know that in lots of pioneer families, even if they weren't just single women, that men and women did really equal work on their homesteads and on their farms and in their pioneering communities. And so the thought is that men probably saw women as more equal to them because women were so important to their success, and that women probably also felt that equality and that they would then push for equal representation and equal votes as well. One of the other interesting things about the West that supported suffrage was that although there were fewer women in the West and they were more spread out, the women in the West really created a pretty large network of different types of social and civic groups and clubs. And part of that was probably because they were lonely. They wanted opportunities to interact with other women. So they would form these clubs around shared belief systems, shared religions, political interests, social interests, or just shared hobbies. And this became important for the suffrage movement because women got used to meeting in these groups and discussing how they could affect positive change in their communities. So when it came time to organize for suffrage or to think about how they could gain more power to make more change, these women's groups were really important. So before we reveal what the first state was to grant suffrage, what do we have for guesses out of those 11 states?
We have a guess for Wyoming and Montana.
Excellent guesses. Wyoming is 100% correct. I actually have two dates here for Wyoming. So Wyoming gave women the right to vote as a state in 1890 because that's when Wyoming became a state. But they actually gave women full suffrage way back in 1870 when they were still a territory, which is pretty impressive. So this year, Wyoming is going to celebrate 150 years of women's suffrage. And when they came into the Union, when they became a state, the federal government tried to tell them that they should take that right away from women. And Wyoming said, nothing doing. We will stay a territory forever if we can't give women the right to vote. So that's really pretty impressive. And part of the reason that women got the vote so early there were a lot of those reasons we just chatted about. So before we get into the arguments that the suffragists were using, it's important to think about what was the opposition saying? What were anti-suffragists saying? And we're going to now focus in on Montana specifically as kind of a case study for what did the battle for suffrage look like. And this is a leaflet that was printed by the Montana Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And these organizations existed in states all around the country. And they make some really interesting arguments that are also kind of reflected in that cartoon that we looked at earlier against suffragettes. So I highlighted a couple here on the slides, but in general, what the opposition is arguing is that if women are given the right to vote, they will start neglecting their children. They argue that women will start neglecting their homes, that they will make their houses unstable, that they will become unfit mothers. Some of the interesting ones here that I highlighted, there's one that essentially says that women are already too busy. And so if you tried to ask them to vote, that would overburden them. It would exhaust them, that they don't have the ability to take on one more responsibility. And one of the other arguments that we see made here is that women already have their own domain, essentially. They already have their own realm of influence, and they should focus all of their energy on that realm. So that's essentially saying women should just stay at home. They should deal with things that deal with the home. So they should take care of their children. They should take care of their house and focus their energy there and not on politics. And so we see these types of arguments over and over. And we see them again in these types of political cartoons. So this is similar to the one we saw earlier. And here you see the same types of arguments. So which do you prefer, the home or the street corner for women? Vote no on women's suffrage. So on the left side here, you see that they've depicted someone who's a mother. She's drawn very nicely put together. She's holding her child. And then the other option is to be a suffragist. And they've, again, drawn the suffragist as being, she has messy hair, she's kind of disheveled, she looks pretty angry, she has angry features on her face. And so again, the anti-suffrage movement is setting up this idea that you can either be a good mother, a good wife, a good homemaker, or you can have the right to vote, but you can't have both. And this might seem maybe a little silly to us now, but it was actually a really effective argument, because if your entire life has been devoted to your family, to your children, to your home, and then you're told that if you want votes for women that's neglectful or ruinous to your home, then of course you maybe wouldn't want to have a vote if that meant that you'd be neglecting your child. And I think probably none of us like to be told that we would be ugly or angry if we supported a certain viewpoint. So it is actually a pretty effective argument for people at the time. But we have our pro-suffrage folks out there, and they're deciding how to best counteract these arguments. And it's really important to remember that the government didn't just wake up one day and say, we're going to give women the right to vote because they deserve it. Instead, it took decades and thousands of really dedicated suffragists to bring about this type of massive political change. And so this isn't a top-down change to our power structure in the country. It's definitely a grassroots, bottom-up change. And so we see that it's the people who are pushing for this change. It's not just handed to them. And so I listed a few of our pro-suffrage arguments here. Some of the really basic ones are, of course, that women should not have to obey laws that they don't have a voice in creating, that they don't have a vote in making, and that women are equal to men and they are equal citizens of the United States, and so they deserve equal votes. So those are two of the very basic arguments for women's suffrage, but suffragists in Montana and in other states realized that those might actually not be the best arguments in order to get male voters on their side, and it is men who are going to decide if women are able to vote or not. And so what they end up doing is taking kind of the same argument that the anti-suffragists made, and they flipped it on its head almost. So they essentially said that because women are such good mothers, because they're such good homemakers, that that's going to make them really good voters as well. So this morality argument that women will vote for social improvements, they'll make all of our lives better. And we see the suffragists adapt this depending on who they're talking to. So if they're talking to workers, the working class, they might say, well, women care about you, and they'll vote for things like better working conditions, a minimum wage, shorter working hours. Or if the suffragists are talking to other women or maybe educators, they would say something like, well, women care about children. We understand how important it is that they are safe and cared for, so we'll vote for laws protecting children or laws improving our education system. So they take this argument and they adapt it to whichever audience they're talking to. And one of the objects that I really like in our collection here, I'm not sure if you can see the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, but this is a booklet that was printed by pro-suffragists, and it says all the reasons why you should not vote for women's suffrage. And then on the back it says, there are none. There are no reasons to not allow women the right to vote. So once women get this message, once the suffragists decide on what their message is, they have to get it out to the people. And one of the primary ways that we see success for political or social change is to have a really strong organizing body, a really strong leaders who are able to organize all of the suffragists and get them behind this message. So for us in Montana, that major organizer was a woman named Jeanette Rankin, and you can see her on the left here. She's holding a banner at a suffrage rally and standing in the back of a car. And Jeanette was originally from Montana, and she went out into some of the other Western states, and she worked on successful campaigns in the rest of the West. And she brought those tactics back to Montana, and she helped to organize all of the thousands of women in the state and men who were supportive of women's suffrage. She also helped organize all of the different clubs and organizations that were pro-suffrage as well, because in the different cities in the state were different types of suffrage organizations and people who had banded together. So they all just needed to get behind the same message and working with the same methods. So what the suffragists did, once they had a bit of a clearer plan, clearer organization, is they mounted a pretty massive campaign. And it's really similar to a lot of the campaign methods that you see politicians use today. So the suffragists at the time were doing things like going door to door and talking neighbor to neighbor and trying to convince their communities to support women's suffrage. We also see that they created quite a bit of printed material, so leaflets and pamphlets like the one we saw on the last screen, and the one that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here. This one is about why women teachers of Montana should have the right to vote. And they also wrote newspapers, and they distributed thousands of these to people in the state of Montana. Some of the other things that the suffragists did in order to get suffrage passed was to go on speaking tours throughout the state and throughout their communities, and also to hold public events like parades. So we'll talk about those really quickly as well. Now, the idea of a public speaking tour, I think, is really interesting because as we saw in these two anti-suffrage cartoons, people who went out to speak on the street, to speak to their communities, were depicted really negatively. And it's true that to go out as a woman by yourself and speak to random groups of people was really not necessarily normal for society at the time. And so the suffragists that did this were actually really pretty courageous. They were pretty brave. And they were definitely going against the norm of what was happening at the time. And they were doing it at kind of great expense to themselves. People clearly didn't like seeing women out there on the street corners and advocating for their right to vote. And you can see that in these types of cartoons. But the suffragists still went out and did it anyways. So in Montana, they went and spoke to just about everybody that they could. They went out and spoke to labor unions. They went out and spoke to church groups. They spoke to those women's clubs that we talked about earlier that were so popular in the West. And they even went out places like schools. So they would go to your school, they would talk to the students, and they would try to get students like you to tell their parents or their fathers that they should vote for women's suffrage. And one of those women here was a woman named Belle. And so she went out and did lots of different types of speaking in the Helena area and throughout the rest of Montana around Helena. And she wrote a really great memoir. And what she wrote about was how upset her family was that she was going out into public and speaking and campaigning for women's suffrage. And you see here, she says, "My mother was horrified. She said no respectable lady would speak on a street corner." So Belle and other women like her were certainly pushing back against what their families expected for them as young women, what society expected for them. And they might have done it at great personal cost and kind of being made fun of and shunned by the ones that they cared about. We also see public events like parades that the suffragists put on, and parades were a really great way to discuss suffrage or to get suffrage out into the public eye in a very kind of positive, fun atmosphere. And so you see here, this is a car decorated with all these banners that say "Votes for Women." And so suffrage parades would draw hundreds or thousands of people. The suffragists could talk to all of these different people. They could hand out all of that printed literature, and in general, just get their message out to a big crowd of people at one time. And this parade in the picture here happened just before Montana voted on women's suffrage, just I think about a week or so before the suffrage went to a popular vote. And at that time, Montana did pass women's suffrage. It was 1914, and we became the 11th state to allow full suffrage for women. So let's go back to the national scene now, because by the time Montana grants women full suffrage, the suffragists on the national level are getting pretty frustrated with this state-by-state approach. So like we said, they did make some progress, but it was really pretty slow progress. After 25 years, they only had 11 states that allowed full suffrage. And so in 1915, the national organizations decide that they're going to refocus on a constitutional amendment. And this is when we start to see some of the really more aggressive campaigning techniques. So they're still doing all of the things that the women, the suffragists in Montana and in the West were doing. So they're still putting out pamphlets and leaflets, and they're going on speaking tours, and they're having parades, but they're also doing things like having protests and having pickets and going in front of the White House and protesting. And what I think is really interesting is that even though women in the West already had the right to vote, they could have just stayed home and enjoyed their own right to vote, many of them headed east. They went to Washington, they went to other states, and they really worked on helping other women gain suffrage as well. And so here is a woman from Billings. Her name is Hazel Hunkins. She's on the right-hand side of your screen, and she's actually also in the left-hand picture. She's just in the background, but she's on the picket line here in both of these pictures. And she came all the way from Montana to Washington, D.C., and she lived there for 2 years protesting. She came in 1917, and she spent the next 2 years on the picket line in D.C., and she was actually arrested at least 3 different times, once because she chained herself to the front gate of the White House. So like I said, we're seeing these much more aggressive campaign techniques by the suffragists, and we're also seeing a more aggressive response by the police force or by the authorities, and they're arresting suffragists, and then the suffragists are going on hunger strikes while they're in jail. And that's a lot of dedication because they still don't know how long this is going to take, when this amendment will come out and be passed. But all of the hard work of the women who are on the picket lines, the women organizing the parades, the women writing the articles, all finally works out for them. And in 1919, Congress passes the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment, I have the original 19th Amendment here, and you see that it basically says citizens of the United States are going to be able to vote regardless of their sex. So they won't be denied the right to vote based on sex. Now, because of the constitutional amendment process, it takes a whole nother year before it's fully ratified by those 75% of the states. So we actually celebrate the 19th Amendment passing in August of 1920. So it'll be 100 years here coming up soon. And the last thing that I'll leave you with before we open it up for questions is that it's really important to celebrate the 19th Amendment. This took years and years and hundreds and thousands of men and women who were really dedicated to this cause, who really believed that women are equal, that women needed to have the right to vote in their government, they needed to be represented. But the 19th Amendment didn't necessarily apply to all women. So what I'm going to challenge you to do once we're done here is to go out and maybe explore a little bit who was left out of the 19th Amendment, which women were not able to vote, and which women struggled to vote for many years following this. There is a really long history of disenfranchisement in this country, and it's got a lot of great stories for you to explore. So I left a few different congressional acts at the bottom where you can maybe start your exploration from, but I encourage you to take a look at the history of voting rights and enfranchisement throughout the United States. So Jamie, do we have any questions?
I don't see any at this point. Any questions out there that you have for Lisa? We would love to take a few minutes to answer those for you. Annika has one. She just needs to type it in. Go for it, Annika. Thank you, Jessica. It's going to be a good question, I can tell. Did any suffragists actually break any laws to show their point of not having to follow laws they didn't have say in? I'm going to read that again.
I think I got it. You know, I don't have a specific example. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if they did. I know that in other countries, especially for example in Great Britain, they were the suffragists there who kind of reclaimed the term suffragette for themselves. They were quite a bit more, they're often called militant or radical, but they certainly broke quite a few more laws there, but I would not be surprised at all if women did here. I don't have a specific example to give you, but I bet if you started doing some research, you would find some really great stories of laws that women refused to follow, or maybe taxes they refused to pay because they didn't have any say in passing those laws.
Good question. Thanks for answering that, Lisa. Anyone
else? Yeah,
else?
that was a great question.
I think that's all we have today. Thank you for that great information.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for joining in with us today. That was a lot of fun for me.
On Thursday at 12:10, we will be with Jordy in our reptiles exhibit at the museum. He will be teaching us about lizards, so sign in at 12:10 on Thursday. And then Friday, we'll see Scott Williams again with Paleo All-Stars, also at 12:10. So he'll walk us through the paleontology collections and show us what he considers to be the biggest and the baddest and the coolest collections that we have in our paleo wing. Let us know how we did. You can always send an email to moroutreach@montana.edu if you have suggestions for future programming or have feedback on today's program. We would love to hear it. You'll also receive a evaluation from Streamable Learning. Put a minute into that and we'll do our best to take into consideration that feedback. So thank you all. Thank you, Lisa. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.